It gives me great pleasure to welcome Monojit for the AI and Society Talk series. Monojit is right now a professor at MBZ AI, that's the University of AI in Abu Dhabi. But for the longest time, he's been with Microsoft Research India and a very close colleague and friend of mine. We've practically done hundreds of projects together while he was at MSR India, and we continue to collaborate even now. His research interests center around the convergence of language, technology, and society. And he's very interested in learning more about the misrepresentation of linguistic and cultural diversity in and by foundational models. He's actually an NLP scientist and researcher by training, but over the years, he's kind of become much more interested in how language is used and how language is a part of the socio-cultural system of any community, and how does that impact technology and how does technology impact that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Monojit to start.
Thank you, Kalika, and good morning, good evening to everybody. It really feels rather weird to be introduced as an outsider to MSR, because as Kalika said, I pretty much spent most of my career in Microsoft. So from 2007 to 2023, I was in Microsoft, and most of this time I was at Microsoft Research. Only the last 1.5 years I was in Microsoft Turing. But nevertheless, the team, the photo that you can see with Kalika, Sudena, and this is from back from, I think, 2014 or so, when we were working in Project Melange on code mixing, and pretty much the whole group that we had set up there had been working on low resource languages and issues of multilingual societies and so on. And just a year ago, I joined MBZ UAI, which is the first university on AI in the world, and it's in Abu Dhabi. So that photo on the top that you can see is our team at EMNLP. So we have an entire department on natural language processing, because the university is on AI, so naturally the departments are like NLP, computer vision, machine learning, and so on. And we have 18 faculty only working on NLP. So with that, let me tell you a bit more, before getting into the specifics of the talk, let me tell a bit more about my research interests and research vision. So as Kalika already alluded to, very broadly speaking, I'm interested in equitable AI, or making AI useful and safe for every, let's say, language, every culture, and essentially every user. So today's talk will be mostly about the culture part, which is something I started looking at in the last 2 years. Actually, we started working on culture back in 2017. We had a project at MSR at that time called artificial social intelligence. But I would say we were quite ahead of our time, because at that time, one of my colleagues from MSR had commented after a talk I had given on ASI that, models can't even do simple semantic processing, and you are talking of complex pragmatic understanding. First let your NLP models understand simple statements. So and the world changed in 2018 with BERT and transformer models, and after that it has been phenomenal, right? So I think we were a bit ahead of our time when we started the ASI project, and then we stopped it at that time. But yeah, now again, I think it's the right time to continue it. So it's very exciting. So and I'm not going to talk about language or in this particular talk, but I do work on low resource languages as well. Apart from how to make AI useful and safe for everybody, I'm also excited by the other aspect of how AI can help understand culture better. And again, I think AI has a strong potential of revolutionizing and changing the way we do social sciences and cultural studies. We already are seeing the early signs of it, and I have some work already going on there as well. But again, I won't get time to talk about that. So about culture, uh, of course, languages, we have done a lot of work at Microsoft showing how LLMs underrepresent, misrepresent most of the world's languages. Something like 88% of the world's languages spoken by 1.2 billion speakers are not at all represented in any of the generative AI models. But recently, we did a similar study for AI music models, so music language models to be specific. And we found a very similar statistics that the music of the global south is very, very underrepresented. Of all the data sets that we analyzed together in terms of number of hours, global south is represented in 5.6% of the data set, and remaining is the global north. And if you do analysis across many other dimensions, you will see similar skew within music, I'm saying. Now, music is one of the fundamental.
Monojit, if you could explain what a music music language model is.
Uh, a music language model is a model that generates music given description in language. So it is like, imagine DALI, where you describe an image and in language and it generates the image. Here, instead of an image, it generates a music. So something like generate a happy piece on violin in Beethoven style, and then it generates a piece. Or you could get as elaborate and detailed in your prompt as you wish. Now, the happy piece on violin by Beethoven, it would generate quite well. But if I had said generate a poignant piece in Raga Bhairavi in sitar, it would be very, very bad at that. So that's what we show in this work, that global South music genres from global South are very underrepresented in these models. So that was just one snapshot, but you can see this theme coming up again and again in many aspects. And there is a big risk of cultural homogenization because of AI. Because, for instance, in the music case, right, imagine that most people, and there is already evidence for this, that most people are using these models to generate music for their reels, etc. And therefore, we can expect that there will be, this queue will further have a, uh, vicious cycle leading to further marginalization of genres that are underrepresented. There has been a similar study in Cornell about writing styles, and they showed that AI generated, generative AI based writing assistants lead to homogenization of writing styles. And usually these writing styles are more geared towards certain groups, like typically US or Canada based writing style. And the study was between US and India, two cohorts. And it showed that how AI generated writing, when used by AI assisted writing, when used by Indian, they really moved away from their natural style much more than what happened in US. But in either case, there was cultural homogenization. So the point is that it is extremely important that most of the cultures around us are well represented in these LLMs, and the applications that we build so that there is less risk of homogenization. And this is not something that I'm the first person to say. Uh, Very interestingly, 2 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago, back in 2020, there was hardly any paper that talked about culture, like I already mentioned. But this graph plots quarter-wise number of papers that we see getting published in the domain of LLMs and cultures. And you see that how it's exponentially growing. So there is a big group of scientists who are interested in looking at the intersection of foundation models and culture. More specifically, this is for LLMs and culture. And the common narrative that emerges in all these cases are that, okay, LLMs are biased towards Western culture and they under or misrepresent non-Western culture. But then a natural question is then, okay, we want our machines to be culturally aware, but why and when? Of course, I talked about cultural homogenization, but it depends on a lot of factors, right? How people are using them, in what context. So it isn't very clear in any of these studies, as I shall argue later with more data, that it's not clear why or in what context cultural awareness in machines are very important. And that will be the primary theme of today's talk. So first, let me lay out the typical research agenda in the papers that we see today. So people ask two kinds of questions. One is, are LLMs culturally biased? And the second is, if they are biased, how to overcome these biases? And to show that LLMs are culturally biased, there are two strategies that we observe. One is what I call culture-specific probing. So create test sets for a culture. So for instance, I want to test whether my model understands Indonesian culture. So I will probably create a data set which asks a lot of questions about Indonesia specific questions. And I will test different models, how well they can answer it. And there are already data sets like MMLU, which are more, let's say, North America specific questions. And if you try with them and you can compare, you can show, okay, Indonesian specific questions are not answered that well as US specific questions. And you can show that there is a bias. Or there is this other way of doing these studies, which is called socio-demographic probing, where you ask the model to behave as personas from different socio-cultural background. Like imagine that you are a person from such and such country and such religion, and how would you solve this task or answer this question? And depending on those answers as well, you can probably show that there is some sort of biases. We will look at these examples in some more detail. And once you have shown that there is some bias, obviously the way to get rid of cultural biases could be like you try giving prompts which give a lot of information about a culture, or you can fine tune with data from that culture, right? So this has been the strategy. So I am going to question these strategies, like how valid or scalable these strategies are. What are we missing out here? But before we get in there, I will take maybe 15 minutes to give you a typical example of this kind of study, which I did. And this was a work done at Microsoft. So in this particular case, so I was at Turing, Microsoft Turing at that time, and I was looking at the RAI aspects of Bing Copilot that was just being released around that time. And one of the things that bothered me is the policies themselves, right? So there were a lot of different policies, like what to be filtered, what not to be filtered. And it seemed like, these policies are quite arbitrary. Of course, these were well thought out and decided by a body or some people, but they don't apply in all context and everywhere, and in different contexts and different applications. It almost seems like these are arbitrarily decided. So to test this kind of, I mean, ideally, we would like the LLM itself to somehow, or the system itself to have some sort of understanding that based on the application context and the need, it could decide what's the ideal, policy here should be. And we wanted to run a small experiment to see how well models could do what we called moral reasoning. And to create a setup for that and a data set for that, we created moral dilemmas. Now, moral dilemmas like trolley problems, many of you might have heard about already, but let me give you a more colorful example of a moral dilemma from the Hindu epic Ramayana. So in this epic, the hero is Rama, who is seen here, this person on the right. And this is the king, Dasharath, his father, and it's a Dasharath's dilemma. Dasharath went on a hunting expedition 10 years ago, before this scene is happening. And he had 3 queens, and he went on the hunting expedition with his second queen, who is standing here. And a tiger attacks Dasharath. And this queen, who is very brave, she shoots an arrow at the tiger and saves Dasharath's life. So Dasharath is extremely grateful to his queen, and he asks her for anything that she wants, because you saved my life, so please let me know what I can do for you. The queen is very smart. She said, I will ask you when the time comes. And Dasharath says, okay, granted. I promise you to give you whatever you ask for when you ask for it. Now, 10 years later, Rama is now going to be declared as the crown prince, and Dasharath had 3 queens. So Rama is the son of the eldest queen, and she is the second queen. So at that time, this queen comes and tells Dasharath that you had promised me to give whatever I ask, send Rama to exile for 14 years, and make my son Bharat as the crown prince or the king. And Dasharath is really torn, right? He has a very strange dilemma. Either he has to break his promise that he made to his queen, or he has to send Rama to exile without any fault of Rama. So would it be fair on Rama? Or whether, or even the people around, right? The citizens did not want it either, because Rama would be a very ideal king. So what should Dasharath do? Now, I don't know how many of you already know about Ramayana. If you know, or even from the photo, this image, you might have guessed that Rama was actually sent to exile. This is typically the narrative arc of any epic, right? That something bad happens with the hero, and eventually they emerge, fights all atrocities and challenges, and comes back as the hero, become the hero. So that's what happens here. But the question is then, why was Dasharath an unfair king? Why he chose to keep the promise? We'll get to the answer in a moment, but this kind of dilemmas actually happen every day, right? Like, for instance, who should be the first author of a paper? This is such a common thing, like even at MSR, I remember not between colleagues, usually these fights would happen between the research fellows who would work with us. And now I see it with the students who work with me. So, and people would come up with different kinds of reasoning for why somebody should be first author and should be not. And it's not that some person is right or wrong. It's often, it's a, pitching some values against each other. So for instance, is keeping a promise a greater virtue than being fair to your son? And the interesting thing is there is no good, right or wrong answer to these questions. And often the answers are deeply rooted in culture. For instance, keeping a promise is an extremely important part of certain sections of the Indian culture. And there are, in fact, interesting proverbs around it as well, which all goes back to these epics, for instance. Now, but it's not the same everywhere in the world, and social scientists have shown this. For instance, in this map of World Value Survey, there are many such actually attempts to classify culture, and and I would say all of them suffer from some problem or the other, because you cannot really, culture is very elusive to define, right? Very difficult to define. But each of them take a certain aspect of culture and try to model it. In WVS, or World Value Survey, it's mostly these two dimensions that they want to capture. One is survival versus self-expression, which is the x-axis, and one is traditional versus secular values. And countries here, like the Nordic countries, are high on self-expression values, so more like individual freedom and freedom of expression, and also secular values. And whereas countries here, like African and Islamic countries, are more about traditional values and survival values. And of course, it's not about which is right, which is wrong. It's, I mean, there was for a moment, some social scientists tried to make this claim that this is the axis of, progress. But obviously that's because the people who colonized are mostly here, and people who got colonized are here. So it's a very colonial view, and nobody accepts that view anymore. So it's very hard to say, or it's a useless pursuit to try to even say which is better than what. But it's just a description of how the world is, and the point that different parts of the world follows different values. Now, if we want to measure, how LLMs do. So suppose you ask such a dilemma to an LLM. So this is the story of the dilemma. Let's say it's a different dilemma, but you could imagine Dasharath's story here. And you could ask the LLM, what should Dasharath do? Now, the problem is this is not a good test, because whatever the LLM answers, it's going to be, you can't say right or wrong, right? Because there is no right or wrong here. So we changed the test a little bit. We added, so basically these kind of dilemmas exist, data sets exist, and moral psychologists use it. And we added a few more dilemmas to it to make it more, to span different values and different cultures. So this comes back from 1979. It's called Defining Issues Test. But we changed the test a little bit. We added what we call the moral principle here. The moral principle states in a very specific way, what is the value that that the person here in question would like to uphold. And this is very, I mean, these principles are defined in such a way that there is a clear resolution for the dilemma. For instance, in Dasharath's dilemma, imagine I said the policy is a king should always keep his promise. That is the most important thing. Then it's clear what Dasharath should have done. And I could say, the king should not be unfair to any innocent. And then probably it will shift the decision in other ways. So these policies were designed in such a way that there was a clear resolution. So ideally now there is no confusion. And if the models are able to do proper reasoning, they should be able to get to the right answer. And what do we observe? So we tested these 5 models, and they are organized in order of their sizes. This was GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4. And don't look at all these numbers, they're confusing. Just look at the last row, which is the average, and higher the better. So 100% means everything answered correctly as expected. And you'd see that GPT-4 is pretty close to 100%, which is good. It does look like it can reason quite well. GPT-3 is close to random, even though we had 3 options. One is should do it, one is shouldn't do it, and one is can't say. The models never selected can't say. I mean, none of the models ever selected can't say. So effectively, there were 2 choices. So 50% is random. So GPT-3 can't reason at all. Not surprising, right? But what is surprising is as the models grew in size, they got better. So 53 to 78 to 83 to 93. But what happened to turbo? Why 68? Suddenly there is a drop, right? And the point is, so then we try to measure what we call the bias of a model as follows. So suppose a default decision of the model is when you don't give it a policy. Now, if the policy asks the model to decide in the opposite direction, so suppose the default was Dasharat should keep his promise that we observe from a model. Now we change the policy in such a way that the answer should be he should not keep his promise. Now, is the model able to change, flip the decision? And the less it is able to flip the decision, higher is the bias. So 0 means no bias, and a high number means high bias. And you see, GPT-4 has very low bias, which means it can actually flip its decision based on what the policy is, and it slowly grows with the model size, except for suddenly this Chat GPT, GPT 3. It was Chat GPT at that time, which couldn't. And this is what we defined as the over-alignment problem. The problem here is ChatGPT is so overly aligned to certain values that it then becomes very difficult for it to change its stance, even if it demands otherwise. And if you now ask what this value system is to which it is aligned to, no surprises, it's typically this kind of value system. And in fact, there was one dilemma which I did not describe, and I don't have time to describe the dilemma that we added, Rajesh's dilemma, where actually there was a clear conflict between, the two extremes of the dilemma one was to decide in favor of traditional society, traditional survival, and the other extreme was secular individual, self-expression. So it was the two values competing were from these two opposite ends. And this was the dilemma where even GPT-4 could not flip its, decision. So it does seem like the models are strongly aligned to certain value systems, which means if you want to deploy these models in rest of the cultures, you might have a problem, and you might have to do something extra to make sure that it agrees to the kind of value system that users from these regions would expect. Now, this was the conclusion, and of course, we did not administer WVS to. This is a survey, so you can administer it to model. We didn't try that, but there are other people who tried that and showed exactly what I'm showing in this, plot. So this is one, the typical way you show that LLMs are biased towards certain culture. And I'll quickly take 1 minute to describe another interesting way where we showed some bias in LLMs, but it's not bias in LLMs. It's a rather bias in the guardrails that we create. So what happens is, since there is so much discussion about race, gender-based discriminations, we do a lot to make sure that LLMs are not racist, LLMs are not sexist, and so on. But there are other dimensions of discrimination, like caste, for instance, in South Asia, which are not so often talked about. And therefore, the LLMs don't even have the guardrails for those dimensions. And it comes out very, simply in this experiment that we did, where we created a scenario where it's an interview. It's a candidate profile discussion, not an interview. It's a candidate profile discussion. So hiring meeting, rather, I would say. And two colleagues are discussing a candidate. And what we change are the names of the colleagues reflecting certain race, certain caste, certain gender, and name of the person discussed. And with that, we ask the model to generate conversations. And other than, GPT-4, again, is quite good. I would say it did not derail much, but all the smaller models like Llama and Mistral easily generated very casteist comments. comments like they are uncultured and we cannot hire this person because they come from a lower caste and all. It just shows that nobody even thought about building guardrails for these other dimensions. So other kind of harms that can happen in societies or cultures which we have not really thought about. So this is sort of the state of the art. Now, let me go back to the main questions. But before that, is there any question? You can stop here for a moment.
No, not for now. We can continue.
Okay, great. So we saw that we are trying to measure cultural bias using certain strategies. So one natural question is then, we are talking of values, yes, fine, or we are talking of caste, but culture is much more complex, right? So how do we define culture when we are talking of, measuring cultural bias? And is this a robust technique to measure cultural bias? I mean, for example, the two experiments that I mentioned, one in detail and one briefly about the caste, are these really robust ways to measure biases in LLM? What we mean by even biases? And of course, once we can answer these two questions, the third question would be, uh, when we talk of overcoming cultural biases, what do we even expect from the models to do? What would be the ideal behavior? So to answer the first question, we did a study of all the papers published till middle of last year, and that talked of culture, studying culture, and we tried to see how they defined culture. So this was with respect to the first question, what is culture? And I would specifically like to call out Jackie, who was a collaborator in this project, and of course, my ex-colleague at now in MSR Africa. So what we observed is none of the papers that we studied actually define culture from an anthropological point of view. Rather, culture is studied through some proxies, and I will come to in a moment what do I mean by proxies. The common narrative is, of course, LLMs are biased towards some notion of Western culture. And the most important gap that we observe is there is hardly any situated study of actual LLM-based applications in different cultural settings. So the examples that I showed were not really actual applications, right? And we did not study users interacting with the system and what impact did the bias had on users. These are more like model level studies. Turns out that there is, with LLMs, there are at least till, to best of my knowledge, no or one or two studies only, which looks at, actual effect on the end user of such biases. So this was the biggest gap. Now, talking about the proxies. So whenever we talk of culture, it's always defined at a level of a group. Now, this group can be defined by certain sort of what we call demographic proxies or demographic variables, if you will. Now, this could be things like ethnicity, which is actually quite a well-studied dimension in the literature that we surveyed. Language, of course, and region. In fact, region, as often it is these days called the geoculture, geographical culture, is one of the most studied, dimensions. So, and typically people go with countries, right? And you can see the problem with that, because often when you talk of countries like USA or India, they're very heterogeneous within themselves. So it's very hard to talk about a broad US culture or a broad Indian culture. Of course, you can talk about it, but it would be like stereotyping or overgeneralization. Then the other dimensions which people looked at are gender, race, religion. By the way, I'm not talking about gender bias here or racism here, racist, or how to put guardrails against racism and things like that. What I'm talking of is looking at the cultural elements in, let's say, across races or across genders and study around them, and religion. But there are many things which are not studied. One of the things which is conspicuously missing from here is um, financial level, social class or financial level, which which or urban rural. So those kind of cultural, because if you think from a user interface point of view, those things might make a big difference, especially in certain parts of the world. The gap between urban and rural users is much higher. Gap, by gap I mean difference. So the difference in expectation between an urban user and a rural user might be much higher than difference between the two genders, or the genders, for instance. So that's one thing which is missing. The other thing is, you are talking of a group, but what are the things that you are studying about the group? Because, like I said, culture is very complex. So you can't study everything in a single study. So some of the things which people seem to have looked at is emotions and values are the most common thing. In fact, we ourselves looked at values, like I said in the example. And this is probably because values, there are data sets like World Value Survey, Hofstede's value dimensions of different cultures and so on. And there are to the to the mess, if I may say, because otherwise culture is very fluid. There has been a couple of studies about food and drinks, social and political relations, a bit on technology, basic actions and technology. By the way, these categories, Thompson's 21 dimensions of how each culture, and there are many such proposals. It is one of the proposals. There are several other proposals of how culture can be, what is being studied can be divided. So here you see there are a lot of things which are missing. For instance, this Thompson's dimension, like, social, this social relationship, there are lots of details, for instance, here, which have not been looked at, or and 21, there are only 5. Remember what were the others, but yeah, there are many more which are missing. So that being the state of the art, let's move to the second question, which is, are these methods of probing about culture reasonable? To this end, we did this study where we are looking at a specific type of probing LLMs, which is called socio-demographic prompting. And we did some experiments. I'll come in a moment, but I want to call out again here, Kalika and Sunena, who were our collaborators, and this work was supported by the Microsoft AFMR grant. So let's come to how socio-demographic probing works. So you start with a prompt like this. A person's favorite food is, and let's say we plug in a food name here. So this is what we call cultural cue. And then you have how would they solve this? And then you have an instruction followed by a question. Now this question typically comes from a data set. So there are many such, this particular is a biology question, and it comes from a data set called MMLU, a very popular data set to evaluate large language models, mostly general knowledge questions about different topics. I mean, not all general knowledge, some are like math, some are biology, physics, chemistry, like covers a whole lot of subjects, but supposed to be independent of culture, right? The answer to this question should not depend on what somebody's favorite food is. If it depends, then something is wrong with the LLM. Now, what we did was we varied these proxies. Instead of food, sometimes we changed them with countries, names of people, kinship, etc. So we tried various things, and these are highly related to culture, so highly culturally sensitive. Then diseases and hobbies, you won't expect culturally sensitive to be culturally sensitive, but there is a little bit of correlation between maybe certain cultures and certain diseases, or certain hobbies and certain geographies and so on. And lastly, these we thought were not related to culture at all. So, I mean, not related to geoculture at all, like programming languages or planet or house number. So the question would be, if somebody's favorite programming language is Python, how would they solve it? Or somebody's house number is 26, how would they solve it? So this is just to see how robust LLMs are to this kind of probing, right? And in the data sets, we tried data sets like MMLU, where there is these are very factual questions like from science and math. So answers should not depend on whatever queue you plug in here, no matter is it high, medium, or low. And then for there's another data set, ethics, which is also supposed to be universal ethics. But as I said, there is no universal ethics. So you can expect some variation here. And finally, there are data sets specific to culture. So this is called cultural language inferencing. And this is ETICOR, a corpus of etiquettes. So here it should be highly culturally sensitive. So what we expect is when we put a low sensitive proxy here, the answer should not so the answer for the low sensitive data set should remain fixed no matter what we put here. And the answer for a low sensitive proxy should not depend on which data set we are probing it with. So these are the two hypotheses that we have for a good model. And let's see what we see. So this is Llama 3 8 billion model, and on MMLU, where it should not, the answer should be fixed no matter what food you probe it with, right? And you see, I mean, this heat map shows the accuracy as you change the food. And these foods were tied to country names. I mean, we did some rough association, like India was something like biryani, and I forgot the details, but each country had a very characteristic food of that country. So that's how we plotted. And if you change it to kinship terms, the values again change, and you see the colors are also different. So the accuracies also change suddenly. So what's going on, right? And this gives you an even clearer picture. So this is 4 different models. And if you see GPT-4, because that's the model which agrees with our intuition. So let me start with that. So MMLU is this purple one, and you see variation in MMLU. So what we are plotting here is variance in accuracies when we change the proxy. The variation by country, by name, whatever you change, MMLU answers don't change. So that's a good sign. That's what we would expect. But that's not true for the other models, right? You see how much Llama 3 8 billion changes with country names in for MMLU, or even Mistral changes. Then the second thing is for ethics, it does change a lot. And in fact, the ethics dataset was supposed to be universal. It just shows that, I mean, we later looked at the questions, individual questions also, and we can't call them universal. They are culture specific. So here it varies, but interestingly, you know, it varies for everything. So it varies for country, it varies for disease, it varies for hobby. So it isn't clear how GPT-4 comes up with a correlation between a hobby and an ethics question, for instance. So it's not all good, but still better. And others, you can see it varies with almost everything, everywhere, quite randomly. So what it shows is these kind of measures that we have of socio-demographic probing to show that a model is biased doesn't tell us much. It might be just spurious random correlations that we are observing. In fact, one of the biggest problem of measuring bias in LLMs is because of the maximum likelihood decoding. For instance, if you ask an LLM, and this is again a work that I did with Kalika and Sunena, but yet unpublished. If you probe an LLM asking it to generate about a festival from India, it will generate, if you ask that question 100 times, 90 times it will generate Diwali, and 10 times it will generate Holi. Now, somebody might look at it and say, hey, these LLMs are biased towards North Indian festivals, or it is biased towards Hindu festivals, and there are festivals of other religion that it is not covering. But that's not true. when you ask LLMs to generate a festival which is celebrated by Keralan Muslims, which is a southern Indian state, it is able to generate. So it's not that there is no knowledge of it. It's because it decodes it in a maximum likelihood fashion. So it will almost always generate one thing which is high probability. Almost always it will, kind of generate that. So that's why we claim that this kind of socio-demographic probing may not be the best way to identify biases in models. So then the question is, how should we measure cultural awareness and biases in models then? And to answer that question, I think a more interesting and important fundamental question to ask would be, what do we expect from the models and systems, right? And to answer that question, we would need to go one level deeper. What real world applications demand cultural awareness? Because unless we have an application, we can't answer what we expect from systems and models. And unless we answer that, we don't know how to measure it, right? So that should be, I think, the strategy. And in the last 3 minutes, I will quickly talk about something. I mean, we are in a very early stage of answering those. So I have more questions than answers, but I'll just tell you how we are thinking about it. So to start with, we thought we will build an application which requires some sort of cultural awareness. So the application we built is, we call it Culturally Yours. It's a cross-cultural reading assistant. So imagine you are reading a Goodreads review of a book by an Ethiopian author, and the review is also written by somebody from Ethiopia. And now you are not from Ethiopia. Let's say you are from the US. You have some knowledge of Ethiopian culture, but not a lot. Then there might be things in the review that you really don't understand. So what Culturally Yours try to do is, knowing your background, suppose it knows that you are from US and you are such and such year old, it will ask you one or two basic questions about your demographic variables or proxies, as we introduced it earlier. And based on that, it will try to automatically highlight things which you may not understand. And once you hover your mouse over what it highlighted, it will try to explain you what that is. Note that it might be wrong, right, in the assumption. For instance, the article talked about injera bread, and you are a foodie, you know Ethiopian food. You may not know Ethiopian monuments, but you know Ethiopian food. So, you might say, I know this. Once you give that feedback, the model will try to personalize. It will, at the back end, try to build a more precise model of your culture. And which goes much more beyond than your country and your age and your education level, for instance, right? Your personal interests, and a lot of things shapes your knowledge and understanding. Now, before I show you some interesting, theoretical things, I want to mention one user study that we did with Goodreads review from people from 3 countries, USA, India, and I think Mexico, evaluated, marked books from book reviews written by USA, India, and UAE as what was difficult to understand for them. And then we annotated them by linguistic difficulty, cultural difficulty, and so on. And 50% of the difficult to understand spans, more than 50%, come actually because of cultural, mismatch. So, or lack of cultural knowledge. So you already see that there is a need for this kind of a tool. We haven't worked much on the back end, I must say. Like, we are just using simple prompting approach with models like GPT-4. But again, GPT-4 being very good, we do get reasonable results. But what I want to talk about here is what I just told you is essentially a system which uses culture as a prior for personalization. This reading assistant is useful only when it is very, very personalized, right? To start with, it is not very useful probably. But if it starts with culture as a prior, it still gets certain things right. And then it quickly can, personalize. And there is a theory, it's proposed by Hofstede back in 94, which is that, so there is a universal human nature, and culture is something specific to a group which we belong to. And we each have individual interests and personality on top of it. And essentially, we are just using this pyramid when I'm talking of culture as a prior for personalization. And let me end with this, thought that since culture is always evolving, and since culture has a long tail, right? You could talk of culture of Emirati, all women, but you could specify, drill it down to Middle Eastern women, to Emirati women, and Emirati women will share something with Emirati men, but will also not share something with men, but rather share with other Middle Eastern women and so on. So it's a very complex intersection of lot of different demographic attributes that we all live in, right? Live with. So then how do you expect a model to learn or know all of this? And the question we asked was, how do humans do it, right? Humans also should ideally not understand and know all these complex things. And it so turns out that there is this theory of metacultural awareness, and it says to be a good metaculturally aware. So metacultural awareness is awareness not about a culture, but general awareness about how cultures behave or cultures kind of interact. And there are three fundamental principles of metacultural awareness. Um, and a individual who possesses all these three are able to navigate in any culture, irrespective of how much aware they are to that culture. So first is variational awareness, which is given one particular situation, what could be all the different possibilities and what is the prior probability that you assign and how much is your confidence on that. So how good is that to an individual is the variational awareness. For instance, if I ask you which side of the road people drive in Kenya, you may not know the answer, but you know that the space of possibilities is left and right. You won't say it could be top, bottom, down, middle. No, it will be left or right, one of those two. So that's your variational awareness. And you might go one step further. Okay, I don't know the answer, but Kenya was a British colony. British drives on right, so left. So maybe it is left. So that's one level higher. So you have a better prior probability, but you also have an uncertainty. So quantifying those things are very important. And we should measure models on these kind of things rather than just what it is generating. You know, uh, how to do it, I don't know yet. We don't have a clear answer yet. Second is then once we don't know something or we have confusion, there should be a way to state that. So in human-human communication, if I'm in a new culture and I don't understand really something, I might say that, sorry, I don't understand this. So I'm not rude and simply I just don't know this and I'm curious to know this. So this is called explication. And third is negotiation, which is either through observation, indirect observation, or through direct questioning or some sort of probing. How can you identify the or understand the cultural elements from the foreign culture with in a very sample efficient way? And once you have all these three qualities, you are set to navigate through any culture. So ideally, our models and systems should have these qualities. And the argument is the models should have variational awareness, whereas the system level things should be more around explication and negotiation. Our LLMs are very bad at explication, right? They never say what they know, what they don't know. They can't give the uncertainty quantification well. And they hardly ask questions. So this is where we are right now, and this is what I am excited about. And I'll end with this note that it's a different thing to study a culture from outside, and a very different thing to live within a culture and have a lived experience of a culture. And unfortunately, a lot of the data that the models are trained with are written by people from certain demography and certain cultures. And therefore, even if we have data and description and knowledge of other cultures, those are typically thin descriptions written by others and not people from their own lived in experiences. That creates an inherent problem. And I'll stop here. I'll not go through these two questions. You can read it for yourself. I just put out some open questions here, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.